So this is one of the free response questions from a couple of years ago. It says, analyze the home front experiences of two of the following groups during the Second World War. African Americans, Japanese Americans, Jewish Americans, Mexican Americans. Okay? You were to pick two of the four. Intro, one group, another group, conclusion, talk about what happened to them, how did it happen, why did it happen, the other group, how did it happen, why did it happen, conclusion. Okay? So I just wanted you to see that this is typically what you're dealing with on the free response section of the exam. You get to choose the two or the three that you are best at or that you can answer the most. And again, folks, I'm going to give this piece of advice. Don't answer the question you want to answer. Answer the question you can answer. Does that make sense? And don't answer it in the way you want to answer it. Answer it in the way you can answer it. You don't have to believe the argument you make. Just make an argument that you can make. Okay? So, we're going to take a look at, a lot of this is the home front of World War II. Okay? Roosevelt signs the war declaration after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so the United States goes to war. What does that mean? What kind of impact does the war have on the United States? Well, in a very cursory way, if you look at a variety of different groupings here, in terms of business and labor and consumers, you've got a lot of government coordination, you've got mandatory rationing, you've got a lot of shortages. You can't get meat, you can't get sugar, you can't get gasoline, you can't get rubber for tires. Okay, I remember my grandfather had his car up on cinder blocks and he had the tires donated to the war effort. So there are shortages of supplies, rationing of other supplies, and the rationing this time is mandatory. And in terms of business and labor, there's a lot of coordination with the government, like you saw in World War I. African Americans, there's opportunities for work. You see a second great migration, like you saw in World War I. Yet, a lot of these work experiences are segregated. There are opportunities for African Americans in the Army, and they join the Army to do their patriotic duty, but they are serving in segregated units. And a lot of the cities that experience an influx of African Americans, like Detroit, like Cleveland, like Toledo, like Chicago, you are going to see racial violence yet again, like you saw in World War I. Native Americans have a unique role to play in World War II. All of our codes are done in Navajo, because nobody knows the Navajo language except us. Nobody could break America's codes. We had broken the Japanese codes. We had broken the German codes. But nobody could break our codes because they didn't know the Navajo language. Everything was done in Navajo. Latinos, opportunities for work, especially farming opportunities in California and the West Coast, what become known as the Bracero program. This is a guest worker program where Mexicans are invited to the United States to do work because, believe it or not, there's a labor shortage. I mean, we're talking 10 years previous, 25% unemployment. Now in 1941-42, there's a labor shortage. We can't find enough workers. Women are going to go to work. They're going to go to work in war industries. Rosie the Riveter, that's the famous thing. As a matter of fact, Obama just had a bunch of real-life Rosie the Riveters at the White House this past week. And and then war industry, working in war industries, and then support as well, secretarial, filing, things like that. But women are going to go into the workplace to do their part. Japanese Americans, hey, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. There's a great deal of racism associated with that. A lot of Japanese Americans in the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, are going to be rounded up and thrown into internment camps and held there for the remainder of the war. And these are Japanese-born or American-born Japanese, second and third generation American. And just based on the way they look, they wind up in these internment camps. And when they sue for their freedom, when they sue because their rights are being violated, they find a very unreceptive Supreme Court. So you're going to see a lot of impact on a lot of different areas in the United States. Selling the war to America, America coordinates with business and labor through what's called the War Production Board. During World War I, it was the War Industries Board, but it's the same basic idea, coordinating business and labor and resources to make sure that the things that need to be manufactured are manufactured. Office of Price Administration freezes consumer prices. I mean, anytime there's a hiccup around the world today, you see the price of gasoline go up like 10 cents a gallon. That's price gouging. They're using the excuse of events around the world to jack up the price of gasoline. Well, you've got a world war going on. You could jack up the price of anything if you wanted to. The government says no, you will not gouge people. So prices and wages are frozen where they are. And then the Smith-Connolly Act is an act that gets labor unions to make a promise that they will not strike during the war. Remember, labor unions had been given a lot of rights under the New Deal, the right to collectively bargain under the Wagner Act. You had the National Labor Relations Board created. So labor unions felt like they were really in their own here. But during the war, you couldn't have labor unions striking lest war material production be impeded. And so you get a promise from labor unions not to strike during the war. Propaganda, like you saw in World War I, propaganda is going to be used in World War II. Not just posters, but movies. As a matter of fact, Hollywood is going to employ a lot of its actors and directors to make movies that celebrate America's war effort. Ronald Reagan, it really, made his bones doing these war movies. And a number of other famous Americans doing these war movies. Cartoons, I don't know if Mr. Ebley ever showed you the Looney Tunes cartoons. Did he ever show you those in AP World?
I've seen them.
Okay. Where, Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny are beating up Hitler and Tojo and, yeah. So, yeah, that kind of propaganda was used to, galvanize the American war effort. Trying to get Americans to buy war bonds. Again, like World War I, we had to find a way to finance the war. So trying to get people to buy these war bonds, this was a way of helping to finance the war and make people feel like they were a part of the war effort. In terms of African American opportunities during the war, again, you've got these segregated regiments like the Tuskegee Airmen. I know it sounds like I'm giving it short shrift. I'm really not. In terms of the grand scheme of things, just understanding that African Americans during the war are fighting in segregated units really is all they cover on the exam. Now, A. Philip Randolph, who was a member of FDR's Black Cabinet, protested this segregation. He protested the segregation of the regiments. He protested the segregation of war industries. And Randolph said to Roosevelt, you need to do something for blacks. Blacks are, and this sounds like the argument that W.E.B. Du Bois made at the end of World War I. We went off, we fought in this war, we fought for liberty and freedom. The least we could have is equality. Randolph is making the same basic argument to FDR. Only Randolph puts his money where his mouth is, and he says, if you do not do anything to deal with the segregation of war industries, I will coordinate a march on Washington, a protest. When FDR hears that, you see, here's the thing. Why are we fighting in this war? Roosevelt had outlined in the Four Freedoms that America was about freedom. We were we had the freedom agenda. And yet we're going to continue to segregate at home? We can't really go out there with a straight face and say we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting against tyranny, when our own citizens don't have freedom, when our own citizens are experiencing tyranny in various sectors of this country. And so FDR establishes the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which is charged with investigating charges of segregation in war industries. Randolph, after World War II, is going to found an organization called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and that really, World War II is the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. And it really gets its start with A. Philip Randolph and CORE. Martin Luther King comes along in the middle of it. And I mean, King begins to embody it, but it really gets its start here with Randolph and the experience of World War II. I had said that there was a second Great Migration, and indeed, cities are going to erupt in violence. What you're seeing here are protests in Detroit in 1943, race riots, protests. White citizens don't like the idea that blacks are moving into their neighborhoods to take jobs. So while we're fighting against the Nazis and racial tyranny abroad, you've got racial tyranny here in the United States, and it is the absolute conundrum. God bless you. And don't think that people didn't point that out. Our Native American code talkers, specifically the Navajo, used for communication and codes. Latinos, okay, Mexicans invited here as part of what's called the Bracero program. These are guest workers invited to come here from Mexico with the promise that they would come here, work, and then go back home. They never left. So you have a huge influx of Mexicans coming to America, specifically in California, where there were a lot of agricultural jobs, as you know from Grapes of Wrath. And it's going to lead to a cultural clash between whites and Latinos. And what becomes Bracero program, guest workers, Mexicans here on temporary visa, cultural clash. It leads to what's called the Zoot Suit riots of 1943 in Los Angeles. This was when a group of young Latino boys was attacked by U.S. Navy guys who were on leave. And the police sit back and allow the Navy guys and these young Latinos to get into it. It leads to about 2 or 3 days of riots in Los Angeles. Women, Rosie the Riveter. That's the popular imagery of women working during World War II, taking jobs. But I would argue that the majority of women, while this idea is very sexy, you know, women with a power drill, very sexy. Most women who went into the workplace tended to be older and married and took clerical jobs. Rosie the Riveter was a great selling point. That was a great piece of propaganda. Most of the women who worked during World War II worked in offices. Now, my grandmother did work in industry. She was in a factory. She was 19 years old, 18, 19 years old. She worked in a factory making war materials. All right, in terms of Japanese Americans, the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 leads to a great deal of racial hysteria and paranoia. So much so that Franklin Roosevelt acts quickly to deal with this hysteria and paranoia. And I liken it very much to the attack of 9/11 and the hysteria that happened afterwards, the paranoia. Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, which calls for the establishment of an exclusion area. The entire West Coast becomes an exclusion area. Japanese Americans who have been here generations, 2-3 generations of Japanese Americans, what are called Nisei. These are Americans of Japanese descent. These American citizens are rounded up. They are given 48 hours to take care of their affairs, wrap up whatever they've got, pack 2 bags, and move. They're given 48 hours. They lose their homes, they lose their businesses, they lose their savings, they lose everything. And they are moved. Oh, wait. There you go. And they try to protest against it, but they are rounded up, loaded onto trains, and sent to camps like Manzanar. Best chronicled, there were lots of camps, but Manzanar is probably the most famous one, thanks to Chin Wakasuki's work, Farewell to Manzanar. Yeah. No, they were given 3 hots and a cot. It was like prison. Yeah. And look, you're in the middle of the desert. The idea of placing them in the desert is if you break out, where are you going to go? Exactly. Now, these folks are not going to sit back and take this lying down. Fred Korematsu. Fred. How American can you get? Fred Korematsu sues the U.S. government, saying that his First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, every amendment rights were violated. Chief Justice Harlan Stone writes for the majority opinion, and I've highlighted the key phrases in the majority opinion of Korematsu versus U.S. We are at war. Military authorities feared an invasion. They felt constrained to take proper security measures. The need for action was great and time was short. We didn't have time to sit there and figure out, are you loyal or are you not loyal? We didn't know what the Japanese were planning to do. Were the Japanese planning on invading Oakland? Were they planning on invading Los Angeles? Were they planning on invading Seattle? We had no idea. And so, time was short, the need was great, we needed to act. And while we're sorry that your rights are violated, the national security of the nation took precedent over your individual rights. That is the ruling by Harlan Stone. Again, it falls into that category of like Schenck versus U.S. back in World War I. Hey, you can't draft me. That's a violation of the 13th Amendment against slavery. No! Your language represents a clear and present danger to the national security. You are arrested and jailed, and rightfully so. National security trumps civil liberties all the time. War strategy. How do we defeat the Germans and the Japanese, and to a lesser extent the Italians? Well, the Allies, and by the way, the Allies are the US, Great Britain, and Russia. So FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. Again, this all falls back on the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Germans invaded Britain, the Germans attacked Britain, the Germans invaded Russia, the Germans declared war on the United States. We're looking past all of our differences with the Soviet Union and teaming up with them. And what the Allies agree on is that the Russians will continue to push from the east. But rather than launch a direct assault on the Atlantic Wall here in France in 1942, Churchill and Roosevelt are going to attack North Africa. The idea being that the United States and Great Britain are going to go up through what they called the soft underbelly of Europe. Churchill likened Europe to a turtle. And while it had a hard shell on top, you could attack it on the bottom and get to Germany that way. So in 1942, you have the invasion of North Africa. The Americans attack from the west, the British attack from the east, and they essentially squeeze Rommel and the Germans out like a big giant Nazi zit. You then, the Nazi zit. You then, in 1943, have the American and British invasion of Sicily and the push up the Italian peninsula. The Italians fall back, fall back, fall back, until they are reinforced by the Germans. And that's where you wind up with kind of a stalemate here at Monte Cassino in 1943 in Italy. So it's a little more difficult to invade Italy than we had thought. And finally, by 1944, we had come to the realization that, yeah, maybe Germany was softened up enough that we could launch an invasion of France. So we took a Germany first approach to this war. Take care of Hitler first. He represented an existential threat. Japan would come second. Even though Japan attacked us first, we would take care of Germany first. So the D-Day invasion takes place in France, June 6, 1944. This kind of represents the turning point. It is coordinated by Dwight Eisenhower. And as the Americans and the British and the Free French under de Gaulle working together are going through and liberating Nazi territory, they come across the Holocaust. Now, this should come as no surprise to anybody. FDR knew this was happening and yet chose not to do anything about it. As a matter of fact, in the 1930s, Jewish emigres from Germany had managed to escape from Germany aboard a ship called the St. Louis. It was an entire ship packed with Jewish refugees from Europe. They arrived in New York City and sought asylum. The United States turned them back. Anybody know why? Anybody know what law was on the books? Remember the law on the books? The National Origins Act, exactly. The National Origins Act. Yeah. Now look, FDR knew about this, but he said that there was nothing specifically that he could do to help liberate these camps. He said, we need to end this war quickly in order to liberate these camps. But for a lot of the Army guys, they had no idea that this was going on. It was a major surprise in late 44 and 45. Yeah. They went back to Europe, and a lot of them wound up being killed in concentration camps. In the Pacific, the turning point of World War II, most people believe, is the Battle of Midway in June 1942. The idea of the attack on Pearl Harbor was to deal such a blow to the United States that they could not defend themselves in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral who coordinated the attack on Pearl Harbor, recognized that Japan had a limited window to be able to knock the United States out of the war. He knew that the United States had the resources to be able to outbuild and outmilitarize the Japanese. And indeed, by June 1942, while Pearl Harbor had been a devastating blow, the Japanese did not knock out our aircraft carriers. And our aircraft carriers in World War II become the ship that does the most damage. You have 80 planes on an aircraft carrier that have a 300-mile radius. Okay? The day of the battleship is over. The day of the aircraft carrier has emerged. And at the Battle of Midway, we wind up sinking 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers that they cannot readily replicate because they are running out of steel. They are running out of materials. After the Battle of Midway, it's a matter of island hopping across the Pacific. Places like Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. America is basically going, and I know, guys, I understand. Mile wide, millimeter deep. I could spend days talking about the invasion of the various islands. Guadalcanal, Truk, Saipan, all of these places where thousands and thousands of Americans lost their lives. It is enough to know that between 1942 and 1945, America basically hopscotched across the Pacific Ocean on its way to Japan. By late 44, early 45, America had the capability, when it took Iwo Jima, America had the capability of launching 24/7 around-the-clock bombings of Japan. So that by the time you get to Okinawa in 1945, in April, actually, today, what is today? Yeah, I mean, we're celebrating the anniversary of the invasion of Okinawa now. This week is when Okinawa was invaded in 1945. You're going to start to see the Japanese resorting to desperate measures to keep the Americans from coming to Japan. At Iwo Jima, you saw a couple of kamikazes, but by Okinawa, not only are they flying planes into American ships, they are blowing themselves up, and they're even sending battleships out on kamikaze missions, you know, with enough gasoline for a one-way trip. And they are demonstrating that they are willing to die before they will surrender. Guys, it is the kamikaze attacks, this willingness to kill yourself to keep the Americans out of Japan that scares the bejesus out of the United States. What happens if we invade Japan? You're going to have to kill every single one of them. As a matter of fact, they were estimating that the invasion of Japan would take place in November 1945 and would not be mopped up until 1948. That was the estimate. 3 more years of war. They were estimating 10 to 15 million Japanese casualties. They were estimating 1 to 2 million American casualties. Yeah.
Weren't they teaching students in Japan how to dress as American soldiers if that ever wasn't changed?
They basically militarized the entire civilian population. Everybody was expected to defend the homeland and die. Because the emperor was a god. Apparently, if you died in the service of the emperor, you reserved your place in Valhalla. Yeah.
Wasn't the emperor like also doing this civilians like mines back in the Americans, like literally eat them?
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. There's a lot of misinformation going around here. That is what, guys, it is the idea that we've got to prevent an invasion of Japan, save lives, save American lives, save Japanese lives, and end this war now. That leads to the dropping of the atomic bomb. A lot of people are like, oh, we dropped the atomic bomb, we're so bad, blah, 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 blah. You know what? Harry Truman was asked about 20 years after he left office if he had it to do over again, would he have dropped the atomic bomb? He's like, hell yeah. It ended the war. It saved American lives. It saved Japanese lives. I mean, guys, if we're just doing numbers, they're estimating 10 to 15 million Japanese casualties. Million? Did I say million? Casualties. Hiroshima, you lost, what is it, about 100,000 people? Nagasaki, you lost about 50 to 70,000 people. 10 to 15 million? 125,000. And yeah, and exactly. I mean, we firebombed Tokyo with napalm. We actually killed more people firebombing Tokyo than we killed with the atomic bomb. But the idea was to get Japan to surrender unconditionally. And also to keep the Russians out, because the Russians hadn't declared war yet. The Russians hadn't declared war on Japan. They had promised that they would declare war on Japan in January 1945 as soon as the war in Europe was mopped up. Well, the war in Europe got mopped up May 1945. So we were rushing to keep the Russians from declaring war on Japan, lest Russia get their grubbies on any territory in Asia. Because we're looking beyond the end of the war, and we're seeing the biggest threat, not from Japan or Germany, but the biggest threat is coming from Russia. Should the bomb have been dropped? Yes, it's horrific. But war is hell. You can kill people just as easily with bullets and napalm as you can with atomic energy. There's just a stigma attached to the atomic bomb. But again, dropping this atomic bomb in the face of a deteriorating Russian relationship, where the Americans have been working with the Russians against the Germans, that relationship is starting to deteriorate because Russia wants a world that looks like it, and the United States wants a world that looks like it. The last conference that FDR attends, the Yalta Conference, where the UN is finalized. The Soviets agree in January to declare war on Japan in August. Stalin promises that all the territory of Eastern Europe that he has liberated will be open to free elections. When those elections don't occur, that's when it raises, some eyebrows among the Americans. And a lot of people claim that FDR basically gave away Eastern Europe to the Russians at the Yalta Conference.
Good morning, Southern. Today is Wednesday, April 9th, to B-Day. Please stand for your pledge of allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Did you know that the money you are raising for Pennies for Patients will help fund research? In medicine, research means the careful study of a disease with the
In
goal of
July
finding a cure.
1945, at the Potsdam Conference, the United States is going to confront the Russians on the fact that they have not conducted elections in Eastern Europe. Harry Truman, who is now the president, because Roosevelt died April 12, 1945,
Applications for the Royal Kappa scholarships are available from Mr. Smith. Completed applications are due by April 25th.
Harry Truman is going to call Stalin out and basically say that Stalin is a liar. And that's why the Americans are rushing to drop this atomic bomb. Matter of fact, Truman finds out at the Potsdam Conference that the atomic bomb has been successfully tested in Alamogordo, New Mexico, July 17, 1945. So Truman is going to say, drop those bombs as quickly as possible. Let's end this war.
Jostens will be at Southern High on Tuesday, April 22nd.
When the atomic bomb is dropped, Japan surrenders.
Senior products. See Ms. Joseph. Any questions?
April is Autism Awareness Month. All Bulldogs, we need you to pre-order a Bulldog Autism Awareness shirt this week at lunch.
When the war is over with, the territory that Germany had is divided between the Allies. Also, in Japan, when Japan surrenders,
Students who wish to visit the media center during lunchtime must sign up for the quarterly pass by Friday.
I wish it was a tunnel
Congratulations to our
switch.
March 5 for a prize winners: Randy Smith, Tabitha Haar, Morgan Truber, Jacob Richards, and Melissa Rose. Stop by the media center to choose your prize. Our final drawing is next month. Keep reading and you can be the winner of a $50 Best Buy gift card.
Bring in all Art Quest t-shirt money and photo money to your art teachers before the end of this week. There will be a brief but mandatory National Honor Society meeting also this Thursday for all current and prospective members in Mr. Bell's G101 Art Studio. See you there.
The Health and Wellness Club will be hosting an agility ball tournament.
August 6th, they dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima.
Team signups will
August
begin
8th,
April 21st.
the Soviet Union declared war on Japan.
Teams will participate
August
in
9th, we dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. August 15th, Japan surrendered. Technically, Russia was at war with Japan for 7 days. But it gave them title to some land, to some spoils of war. What does Japan wind up getting to occupy? North Korea. And we're still dealing with the after effects of that today. So basically, at the end of the war, you've got the Russian presence in Asia, North Korea. You've got the Russians in Germany is divided between the British, French, Americans, and Russians. So there you've got Germany divided. You're basically setting up the Cold War right here. But the belief is that the United Nations, and you can go back and watch this online if you need to, the United Nations that is set up with a Security Council will be able to handle whatever international problems exist after the war. Because unlike the League of Nations, the United Nations has the ability to do collective security. They have the ability to raise an armed force to enforce UN resolutions. And there are 5 permanent members on the UN Security Council: the US, Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. So surely nothing can go wrong there. each one of those 5 permanent members, by the way, has a veto. So it doesn't matter if they vote 14-1. If the one no vote is one of those 5 members, it doesn't happen.